Hey, what's up guys? I wanted to make a NATO build guide for my Mobalytics written guide that I had put out. It pretty much goes over the exact same thing that the written guide goes in this video. In my opinion, this is one of the most fun classes or builds that you can do because it can range through many different classes. You can do it on Monk, you can do it on Ranger, you can do it on Huntress. I've even done it on Witch, trying to do bleed NATOs. I've done it on Mercenary, I've done it on Warrior, so all on hardcore SSF and all to T15 maps. So I'm just wanted to share kind of my ideas and kind of what I figured out and what works best. Obviously there's softcore versions of this, so but if you're struggling to find kind of bridge the gap between softcore builds and hardcore SSF builds, this might be the video for you, as it kind of goes over how to layer differently other than just min-maxing the offense and just trying to sustain as much life as possible. Hopefully, if you find this video helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll try to do my best to continue to update it, at least in the written format. So make sure to check that out. Without any more rambling, let's go ahead and get into the video. To start, I'll kind of go over just a fundamental base of how the build works so you guys get an idea of what's going on, how do we generate the most damage, and why we're doing what we're doing essentially. So to start, we're going to talk about Whirling Slash. So Whirling Slash has a max stage of 3. Now, this is important because the amount of stages that we do, it reflects on our twisters and how many twisters we have. So if we go over to twisters, we can see that additional twisters per whirlwind stage 1. So we get 3 additional twisters per whirlwind, and there's a max of 3. So that's why we always want to focus on 3. Ideally, when you're moving around, you're not going to really be thinking about that, but you want it at least 3 for the max amount of NATOs. And then also we get an additional 80% per whirlwind stage for a 240% total. This is, again, another way that we can increase damage and really make the NATOs actually work for us rather than kind of like being these weak NATOs that don't do too much damage. Another layer that we can add is elemental NATOs. So there's multiple ways that we can approach this. I'll kind of go over each one within each of the steps of the video. So when we get to end game, I'll kind of go over certain ways to go over that. When I'm talking about leveling, I'll kind of go over what ways that you can generate elemental NATOs through that. But it's just more important to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and that way you know how to generate the most amount of damage per NATO and generate the most amount of NATOs. The first thing we're going to talk about is how we can get elemental NATOs, which give us the extra 50% damage, and how we can start early on and scale them into endgame. There's basically 2 ways you kind of want to do it early on, and that's either with Fangs of Frost, which allows us to parry an enemy, and then we consume that parry to leave behind chilled ground once we hit the enemy. This is kind of a favorable way to do it because you start with the spear and buckler skill, and you can kind of just naturally flow into that progression. It is a level 3 skill gem, so you get it on your, once you progress a little bit into the campaign, but it's a good way to get chilled ground. The other way and the other method is through Frostbomb and Ice Nova. Frostbomb is a little bit support intensive. You want compressed duration and short fuse because you want the bomb to explode as quick as possible. Essentially, the way this works is we throw down Frostbomb, that leaves a cold infusion. We use that cold infusion on Ice Nova, which leaves chilled ground, and now we can use this chilled ground to create chilled NATOs. Once you get enough supports, or if you're starting out as a second character, this might be a good method because once you have compressed duration and short fuse, the ice bomb, frost bomb explodes almost immediately, and we get that instant kind of chill NATO. So you frost bomb really quickly, explodes, chilled ground, and now we have chill NATOs. And then scaling into a little bit towards the end of Act 1, another way you can do it is through the Boots Wake of Destruction. Wake of Destruction dropped shocked ground for 8 seconds while moving, and this shocked ground we can use to generate lightning NATOs. This is my preferred method, and even into endgame, generally I like to wear these because it's the convenience of having the NATOs at your feet at all times is very nice. So yeah, I would recommend this, but obviously it's not something that you can dictate in SSF. You don't know if you're going to drop it or not. So it's kind of up in the air. The last 2 times that I've done NATOs, I've been able to get these pretty early on, so it's something that's worked for me, and they're not a super rare drop to where it's, you know, something that won't happen. The last way, and probably the best way to scale it in the end game, is through your companion. This obviously takes a certain amount of spirit. There's different companions that you can do, but the best one generally is the boar, which you find in Act 3. I'll show you guys in a second. And you either want Trail of Lightning or Trail of Ice. And you want to have this set on your second weapon set, which is our Twister weapon set. And the main reason for that is because we use two different weapon set for Whirling Slash. I'll go over that a little bit later, but essentially you use that, and then once you throw the Twister out, he'll spawn right under your feet. One thing to note about the companion though is that he won't have the element unless he's targeted onto an enemy. So generally that's another reason you want to have it. So you'll be using Whirling Slash to move, and as soon as you see an enemy, you throw it out, and it should automatically target lock onto them and drop the elemental ground that you're using. The best way to get a companion, especially the boar one, which I recommend, is through Jungle Ruins in the Troubled Camp. If you're doing it in hardcore SSF, we no longer have the respawn at checkpoint. So the best way to do it is spawn at Infested Barrens, go back to Jungle Ruins, and then from there you can kind of find what you need. If you're not on hardcore, you could just do the respawn at checkpoint. So you go to Jungle Ruins, you find the Troubled Camp. There should be a waypoint there, and then from there you can just respawn and respawn the enemies until you get the one that you need. This would be the best one. Another way you could do it is kind of through campaign. You can look out for enemies. Once you get to once you unlock the level 9 skill gem, which gives you Tame Beast, you can use this, basically just have it on you. When you find one rare with Trail of Ice or Trail of Lightning, you can tame it, and then you should have that. The only thing is, be wary that different companions have different spirit costs. So make sure the companion that you get is at least a decent spirit cost that blends with the build. And that's pretty much it when it covers to elemental Nados. Like I said, the best one and the one that I recommend is probably the Wake of Destructions when you do get them. Other than that, I would stick with the companion as soon as you're able to kind of outgrow the early elemental ones. The first skill we're going to talk about is our main skill, Twister. Twister is a fizz damage skill, which means it doesn't convert any of our fizz damage to elemental. It only gains the corresponding element that we're using. So whether that's lightning or ice, I don't recommend fire. Another thing to note with Twister is that it always blinds. This is important because there are certain nodes on the tree that allow us to get additional damage or damage reduction or even crit chance from blinded enemies. And because it always blinds, we always have this active on every enemy. Another thing to note also is that it pierces all targets, so there's no need to invest in Pierce. Pierce basically means that once the Nado hits the enemy, it doesn't end there, it continues its cycle. So with that, we'll talk about the first support gem. The first support gem is Projectile Acceleration 3. All of them are good, but the main one you want to be using is Projectile Acceleration 3. And the reason for that is because increases and reductions to projectile speed also apply to projectile damage. This means that all the projectile speed that we use to ramp up the Nados and make sure the Nados are always hitting the target as much as possible also convert over to projectile damage directly. This goes for the tree as well. So this is one of the most important support gems to have. Next, we'll talk about Prolonged Duration. You can use one or two. This is one that you can kind of swap in and out depending on how much skill effect duration you have in the tree. But this allows the Nados to basically last as long as possible. Right now, I have my Nados on 4.8 seconds. That's not a crazy duration. I've got them up to 8-9 seconds. So next, we'll talk about Salvo. Salvo allows us to fire 2 additional projectiles per seal consumed, and we get a maximum of 3 seals. These seals each individually take 2 seconds to accumulate. So you see a little 3 at the bottom of your skill down here. Those are your Salvo seals. There are nodes on the tree that I'll highlight here that allow you to accumulate seals faster. So that's an option that you can do. There's 2 methods that I've used. It's either to using this as an anoint, speccing into it now that they've put it on the monk side. Another thing you can also do is have your Twister duration up to 6 seconds. This will mean that basically by the time your Twisters end, you'll have all 3 of your salvos back. because it takes 6 seconds to get all 3 of the seals back. But this is really important because we get 6 additional Nados on top of what we already have with Barrage and all the other skills. Next, we'll talk about Inexorable Crit. This is a good way to scale damage in the end game. Generally early on, you'll have Elemental Armament 2. This will help ramp up elemental damage early on, but once you scale into the late game, which is you're always going to want to scale into crit, you're going to want to either go with Inexorable Crit, or you can also go with Pinpoint Critical. Pinpoint Critical gives you 60% more crit chance. This is if you're having a hard time finding a good crit spear. Next, we'll talk about Armor Break. Armor Break is dependent what way you set up your frenzy charges. There's 2 different ways. I'll talk about it here in a second when we get to the end. But essentially, with Armor Break, you want to be spec'd into Resonance. Resonance will convert all of the endurance charges to frenzy charge, but never have a downtime of when we can't earn frenzy charges because we have Armor Break. Because of this, it's also important to have a high fizz damage spear, because the fizz damage will allow us to break more armor on more enemies. This is not something that's possible on bosses, so one part that this build struggles, which is gaining frenzy charges on the boss damage. There are ways to go around it, and I'll talk about it shortly as well. For Whirling Slash, we'll save that till the end because there's a little bit of a tricky weapon set up for that, so we'll save that for last. Next, we'll talk about Barrage. So Barrage essentially empowers our attacks to repeat 2 times and a further 1 time per frenzy charge, just adding multiple Nados, which allows us to scale sometimes of upwards of 50, 60, even 70 Nados, depending on how many frenzy charges you have. General best support gems for this are going to be cooldown recovery. This just keeps the uptime on Barrage up as much as possible, so you're able to cast it as often as you need to. Perpetual Charge gives us a 25% chance to not remove charges. This just allows us to build frenzy charges into the 4, 5, 6 frenzy charges. So rather than consuming 2, we're able to generate 3, 4, and then continuously have that set of charges at 25% chance. Next is Heightened Charges. This just has a 20% chance to double the effectiveness of charges. So instead of consuming 6 frenzy charges, it's like we consume 12. This just means more Nados, and that's why I said upwards of 50, 60, 70, just depending on how you can get all of this to stack. And then the last one is Efficiency, which just gives us 40% less mana cost. This is just nice to have, just to have additional mana, because sometimes once you get up there, it can cost a little bit more. Another one that you can substitute for this one is Cast Speed. That just allows you to cast it a little bit faster. Next, we'll talk about the companion skills. The companion, for the most part, is going to be damage reduction, so elemental resistance, increased area. This is just to give the presence, so that you're always in the presence of your companion. If you have haste aura, for example, this last gasp, again, damage reduction, and then minion level just gives it more health. Ideally, you can skip all the damage reductions if you do have Brutus's Brain, but it's not something you can expect to drop. It is a random drop. It is a little bit rare, so just to give you guys an idea of why we're running what we're running. Next, when it comes to Herald of Thunder, we'll talk about defensive layering towards the end here, so I'll skip that. With Herald of Thunder, you generally want to stack as much damage or pen as possible, so we're stacking Elemental Armament 2 for 25% more elemental damage. We're stacking 30% lightning pen. Blind has no use here. Magnified area to scale the area of the Herald of Thunder. And then the last one is Living Lightning. Pretty much just gives us little minions that do additional damage. And these can be really OP the more you stack them. Yeah, I've just come to find that this is a really good support to have in your Herald of Thunder. If you're running the Herald of Ice version of this, it's pretty much the same exact thing, just converted over to cold damage. So you're still going to be running elemental armament, you're still going to be running magnified area. Blind is honestly not really that necessary. I think I just had this in there for whatever purpose I was doing in this build, but blind isn't something that's really necessary in either of them. I would stack either like Embitter or getting additional shock value out of it. So I wouldn't really pay attention to blind in this scenario. Next, we'll talk about some ways to scale defenses. So the 2 best ways is going to be with Wind Dancer, and I would say Blasphemy Temp Chains. I would stay away from Ghost Dance. They've kind of nerfed Ghost Dance. It can still be usable. So if you have, like, let's say a bunch of spirit, if you're using the Scepter version, you're late into endgame, Ghost Dance might be something you can look to spec into, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Wind Dancer, I would spec In here, you can put in a maim, you can put in pin, you can put in blind. These are all kind of additional bonuses and additional debuffs that you can apply to the enemy. And then when it comes to blasphemy, there's two things that I choose to run, and that's either elemental weakness or temp chains. What I'll often do is I'll have both on me, and I'll swap elemental weakness when I'm doing bossing and then temp chains when I'm doing mapping. Temp change just gives you an extra layer. Enemies really slow. It doesn't feel like they're rushing you, and that gives you time to build up that Whirling Slash, those 3 stages of Whirling Slash, and get your Nados off. I would recommend, once you get to a certain point, to just run elemental weakness. Once you get to a certain point in the build and you have enough defenses established, I recommend just going with elemental weakness, period. Elemental weakness is really strong, do a lot of additional damage on top of what your twisters already do. When it comes to temp chains, one warning I do want to give is if you are running Arbiter and you're running temp chains, be aware that that's going to affect his moveset. And this goes for pretty much all pinnacle bosses. It's going to affect their movesets and how quickly they get them off. This can be a good thing, but they can also be a bad thing because it can mess up your timing. So be aware of that. For this, we're just stacking magnified area. This just stacks the presence and makes it a lot larger for a long duration. So the curse has a longer effect. Slowing potency, this just basically adds an additional slow buff to the enemies that we inflict all the curses on, and then which is another reason you kind of want to swap over from temp chains to LA weakness when you have that. And for the last one, we would run Ritualistic Curse. Ritualistic Curse essentially just gives us an additional magnified area, which brings our overall presence way farther. Ritualistic Curse and magnified area and a little bit from the tree, you can pretty much cover the entire screen with your curse. It's really helpful, and it makes bossing really easy. It makes mapping really easy. So that's what I would recommend. And last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about Combat Frenzy. Combat Frenzy is another way to gain frenzy charges aside from the armor break. Combat Frenzy allows you to gain a frenzy charge when you freeze, electrocute, or pin an enemy no more than once every 6.3 seconds. There's no real way to upgrade this, so the downtime in between when you get frenzy charges can sometimes feel a long time. That's why I recommend going the armor break resonance way. I think most people that run Nados go that way because of the downtime that Combat Frenzy has. If you do choose to go with Combat Frenzy, I do recommend with freeze and through Herald of Ice. That's what I tend to do because for whatever reason, it's a lot easier to freeze than electrocute. Another reason also is that electrocute requires you to socket in electrocute into your main twister skill, which takes away a support gem. So that's why I recommend freeze or converting your lightning damage into some form of freeze or cold buildup. The two ways that you can do that, just to give you guys an example, one is through 3 dragons. 3 dragons makes all of your lightning damage hits contribute a freeze buildup. This pretty much activates Combat Frenzy as often as possible, and it's really good. But again, it's a unique, so it's kind of very dependent on if you get it. Another one is the Call of Brotherhood ring. This converts 100% of your lightning damage to cold and gives you additional freeze buildup. This is really strong and pretty much does the same thing, just converts all of your damage. Normally, from what I've seen, your tooltip damage goes down, but I wouldn't really pay attention to that as the damage still feels strong, and when you're able to freeze enemies, you get that damage buff from freezing them. When it comes to what supports you want, there's only really one support, and that's Charge Perfusion. Charge Perfusion gives us a 30% chance to get an additional charge and then a 15% chance to get a random charge. Just make sure that if you are running Combat Frenzy, you are not running Resonance, because you will not be getting frenzy charges. You're trying to get frenzy charges, you'll end up getting power charges, so keep that in mind. And the last skill that we're going to talk about is Whirling Slash, and this tends to be the most confusing because of the way we're setting up our weapon sets. So usually you want to have it set to weapon set 1, and this is mainly just to take advantage of Rigwald's Ferocity. Again, this is a linear support and it's not something that's guaranteed to drop, but you want to have your weapon set up early so that later on you don't have to spec out of the tree and you don't have to switch everything around and make it more confusing. We'll just go over quickly the supports that we use, and then we'll go into how we set up the weapon set. So for supports, you really want to do Rapid Attacks 2. It gives us 35% increased attack speed. We really don't care about damage on the Whirling Slash, as we're trying to just generate those 3 Whirling Slashes to give us the most amount of Nados. Next, we do Magnified Area. This just makes it so that it's easier to pick up whatever element that we're using, because our Nados are based on the Whirling Slash element. So our Whirling Slash picks up the element, and then that when we shoot our Nados out of the Whirling Slash, it becomes that element now. Next is Rage 3. Rage 3 essentially just gives us 15% additional attack speed while we're not at maximum. This is pretty self-explanatory. More attack speed that makes it easier to get the 3 stages of Whirling Slash. One other thing that you can socket in here instead of Rigwald is Blazing Critical. So because Whirling Slash is always going to crit because it's melee, we always are going to get a 15% extra damage as fire. This isn't necessarily always going to be proc, but there are enemies near you, it will always give you that 15% extra damage as fire. Now we'll talk about how we further want to set it up. So your first weapon set spear is going to be the one that has the most attacking spear. Now for me, this flying spear isn't the best base, but it is the highest attack speed that I had for this character. Usually you want to be looking for the soaring spear. The soaring spear has a base of the highest attack speed of any other spear, and it's easy to scale off that, especially if you throw a haste essence on. You should be pretty much set for the rest of the game. Another thing you want to do is also make sure that you don't have anything equipped in your second slot, and this is because we make uses of Dance with Death, which gives us an additional 25% attack speed if we do not have anything in our offhand. Just be wary that if you use in your opposite hand, if you use a life or ES shield, you will have to, it will automatically drop it down and then recharge, and drop it down and recharge. So try to have something that doesn't have ES or life built into your shield. This also goes for reses, so keep in mind that when you are whirling slashing, you're going to have minus whatever the reses that you had on your original weapon lowered. So keep that in mind. Spirit gems that I can recommend if you have extra spirit. So the first one's going to be attrition. This just helps with bossing really, and I would only recommend it for bossing. So if you're struggling with boss damage, this might be one way to get a little bit of extra damage, but be aware that this does take a strength requirement, which is hard to balance when you're doing EVES gear. Just want you to keep that in mind. Another one that you can rock is convalescence. Convalescence allows us to basically recharge our energy shield on the push of a button. It's really good utility for bosses and bossing. So if it's something that you want to swap or you want to put in there, feel free to throw that one in there. It's really good as well. And then the last one that I can recommend is going to be Elemental Conflux. Elemental Conflux just gives you, again, more damage based on on a certain element or the element that you're doing damage on. This can be really good, but it's really costly. This is very good in specific cases, and it's mainly if you're going to be doing Twister on Monk and you're able to get multiple elements into your build. For the most part, you're not going to be running this otherwise. For this next part, we're going to be talking about how we want to gear our character. We're going to start with the body gear and then work our way into the jewelry and then the weapon last. So generally you're going to want EVES gear. That's what I found to be the best. But if you're not able to find a good chest piece to blend, ES works well enough to hold you over. I wouldn't really recommend armor ES, as depending on where you're going to be speccing into the tree, there's not going to be a lot of options for that. But if you happen to be starting on Druid, that is something that you can work into the build. But I would recommend EVES, then just ES, then armor ES. I would not recommend armor. To start, I would say grab yourself in just plain ES helmet, mainly because we're going to be taking advantage of Subterfuge. Subterfuge is a really strong node that gives us 2% evasion per 1% ES. This can stack up sometimes to give you a helmet that's strong as a chest piece. If you're looking at 400 ES, that means you're going to get around 800 evasion, which is a really, really strong combo to work together. When it comes to your body, you're really going to be looking for the sleek base, and you're going to be looking for the highest possible EVES. If you can't find that, then I would recommend to try to go for ES body and mainly try to prioritize the vial. The vial has the highest base ES, and it's the easiest to scale up for ES bodies. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about certain ascendancies and what you want to change up in those ascendancies. But for the most part, these are kind of the bases you want to stick with. So try to focus on the EVES for body. And then if you can't find a good one, go ahead and go with ES. When it comes to the gloves, this is really dependent on what the best setup that you have. EVES is probably not the best for gloves. I would just recommend ES. But if you happen to find a set of EVES gloves that are really strong, go ahead and use those. These kind of go in with the Ascendancy, which I'll talk about when I talk about classes and Ascendancies. But that's what you're mainly wanting to look for. And you're really wanting to try to prioritize 15% attack speed, which is T1 on gloves. This is going to give you the fastest whirling slash, which is allowing you to generate Nados the fastest way possible. When it comes to boots, you're generally going to want to be looking for ES, but the same thing applies as gloves, where if you're not able to find good ES that fit, try EVES. Otherwise, if you're trying to do Wake of Destructions, you're kind of locked into those. Try to get the best version of those as you can. When it comes to belt, try to fill out as many of your reses as possible. Try to stack on a little life. If you feel like you're stacking enough to the point where you don't need reses from a belt, try to look at Ingenuity or maybe Headhunter or something that just gives you strong buffs. When it comes to rings, you're generally going to want to be looking for flat damage and particularly physical or the element that you're looking for, and then percent damage. That's what I tend to focus on. And then I also try to mix in a little bit of rarity, attributes, and reses depending on what I need for the build. Try to find the best combo that works for you. This is kind of dependent on what you drop, but that's what you're going to be looking for. And that goes for both rings. I'll show you both of mine here. When it comes to the amulet, you're going to want to be prioritizing a plus projectile amulet. If you can't get that, try to get something with a spirit in the prefix. Other than that, try to maximizing as much as you can from your defense. So try to get ES, EV, global defenses on the prefixes if you can't get the spirit. Same thing on the suffixes. If you can't get the plus projectiles, try to get all LE res. Try to get attributes. Try to get something that fills out what your build needs. Rarity isn't something that's necessary. I like to put it towards the end of my builds to try to get really good farming going, but that's something that you should not prioritize and you should focus on very last once your build is strong enough to be able to go without certain affixes. When it comes to the anoint, I'll talk about that when I talk about the tree, and this is really just dependent on what play style and what point you are in the build. There's a lot of really good options, and yeah, we'll just talk about it when we hit the tree. Now, one of the better parts is the weapon. So when it comes to the weapon, the ideal spear that you're going to be looking for is called the flying spear. The reason we're looking for the flying spear is because of the implicit that it gives us, which is increased projectile speed. If you remember, we used projectile acceleration 3, which converts our projectile speed into projectile damage while also giving us the projectile speed. That's why this modifier is incredibly strong, because we get an additional up to 35% increased projectile damage from the spear. Along with that, you're mainly going to want to be looking for fizz. I'll put a couple of spears that I've used in the past, and your primary focus is going to be trying to get as high fizz as possible. And if you're not able to get fizz, trying to stack on as much of the element that you're using, so whether that's lightning or cold, that's what you want to prioritize for your prefixes. So that means as high percent fizz, as high flat fizz, as high percent and accuracy fizz as possible. When it comes to the suffixes, ideally your main priority is getting plus levels. So right now, because of the essences, you're only able to get a +3. Sometimes you're able to get +4 projectile that you can recom to a prefix. So try your best to do as much as you can to pick up as many spears and augment and transmute as many as you can to try to get the prefixes that you need. What I've found is that eventually, if you hit enough, if you set your item filter correctly, almost always hit the spear that you need. And obviously there is an RNG portion, but through trial and error, I've pretty much always been able to hit a spear that I want to get. The second thing you're going to be looking for when it comes to suffixes is a crit chance. Baseline, you want at minimum 3 T3. If you can get T2, amazing. If you can get T1, well, you're in luck because you're about to just melt the whole game. Now, when it comes to the base types that you're looking for crit, the Iconian is the best one because it gives you the highest base percent chance. So the Iconian gives you a starting percent chance of 7%. All the other spears start at 5. This means that it's a lot easier to scale with it. Even though 2% doesn't seem like a lot off rip, the way that crit scales with global and local in this game, it makes it very strong to have 2% additional crit. Besides that, if you're able to get a different type of spear like the ones that I just showed a few seconds ago, go ahead and get that. Your main priority is to get as much damage and crit as possible on the spear. When it comes to your offhand, you're going to want to start with either a buckler or a shield. This is kind of scaling early game, mid game, and even into end game until you get your defenses right. But keep in mind, like I said before, when you weapon swap over, if you have ES on your shield, it will not carry over. And if you have reses or life, it will not carry over. So be aware that you're at a disadvantage when you're using Whirling Slash and you have these things on your shield. Once you establish your defenses high enough, you can go ahead and switch to a scepter. Usually I like to get around at least 55% evasion, even 60% evasion, and then go ahead and swap over to the scepter. For the scepter, you're pretty much just going to be looking for as high spirit as possible. This is just going to give you a lot of other options when it comes to spirit gems, like the ones that we talked about. Now, before we get into all of that the tree has to offer, I wanted to go over some ascendancies and classes that I would recommend, at least 3 of them, and I'll kind of talk about some other ones. Try to keep it short and sweet for you guys so we don't extend the video way too long. So the first class that I'd recommend is Amazon. This is because you can get a lot of offensive and defensive help from the Ascendancy. The main one being critical strike, which allows us to take our excess hit chance and carry it over to our crit chance. This is really big because Nados, you want to scale crit in the end. This is a huge end game buff from the Ascendancy that you can get. Additionally, you can get more fizz damage based on accuracy from your weapon. This is kind of situational if your weapon does have accuracy. If it doesn't, then I would go with Predatory Instincts, which gives 50% more damage against enemies with an open weakness. If you don't know what that means, essentially rares and bosses will have a little chunks on their health bar. When you hit this chunk, at that point you will do 50% more damage. Now, defensively, Amazon allows us to double our evasion from our helmet, gloves, and boots, but it comes at a cost because it halves our body armor. Usually when you're running this, you want to run an ES body and then mainly run EV everything else. Another huge defensive layer that it gives us is Mystic Harvest, which allows us to life leech based on our elemental damage as well as our physical damage. Now for this one, you want kind of a specialty glove, and that's called the Essentia Sanguis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This allows our life leech to get converted to ES leech, which means that instead of leeching life, we're leeching ES, and that creates a huge defensive layer for us where we're always getting ES, whether it's in maps or whether it's in bosses, and it creates a huge life pool for you. Additionally, I would also recommend Ritualist for farming just because of the extra ring and bonuses that you get. It gives good rarity, it gives good resistance, it gives good additional damage. It's really easy to scale just based off your gear, but this is kind of situational and it's really more for farming. The number 2 build that I would recommend aside from that is the Monk Invoker. Monk Invoker also gives us a ton of utility. The main one being basically a Timu Rakiatas. What that means is that our crit hits ignore non-negative elemental resistances versus Rakiatas, which inverses them. This is really good. We're either scaling Nados into cold or lightning Nados. And although this is very dependent on a mapping basis, this is really strong against pinnacle bosses. Additionally, we also have Lead Me Through Grace, which gives us additional spirit based on our energy shield and evasion on our equipped body armor. This is really strong because it allows us to gain that additional spirit and give us those additional buffs like Blasphemy, Ghost Dance, Convalescence, those things that we talked about earlier in the video. Another great utility is Faith is Choice, which gives us the option of Meditate. Meditate allows us to get 50% of our current ES as additional ES. This is really huge just because it stacks on so much more life, especially on this side of the tree, which provides so much ES. It's also really good because it acts almost like Convalescence, that you're able to recharge your energy shield at the snap of a button. And for the last 2, you either want to go I Am Blizzard, which gives you 10% extra cold damage, and also on freezing enemy creates chilled ground, or you want to go with I Am Thunder. This gives us 10% extra damage as lightning and gives us 25% chance to drop shock ground on shocking enemies. The last class and probably most popular class in softcore for this build is the Deadeye. Deadeye gives also a lot of utility, and the main utility that it gives is frenzy charges. It also does give a good defensive layer and tailwind. The main ability that we're looking for on Deadeye is Called Shots. Called Shots allows us to socket in a mark, mainly sniper's mark. We use this to get frenzy charges during boss fights. This is a really good solution to figuring out how to get frenzy charge, but we would not be able to utilize the armor break tech if we do this. Another good note about Deadeye is that you can stack an incredible amount of frenzy charges. Avidity gives us 50% chance when you gain a frenzy charge to gain an additional, and because of the other socketed supports, this can stack up to really give you a ton of frenzy charges. And then the last one, Thrilling Chase, which basically gives us an additional 50% chance to double the benefits of our frenzy charges. This is really strong as, again, it gives us so many more Nados, which end up covering the screen and doing so much more damage. The last one is just Tailwind that I would recommend. Tailwind is just a good defensive layer, and it's just strong as it is. Some other notable classes that I can mention are Gemling. Gemling has Thaumaturgical Dynamism. This gives us additional frenzy charges based on most socketed supports, which is usually going to be the green ones. On top of this, we also get quality to skills, which gives us more Nados and additional skill levels. This could be a really strong class, but because of the starting point, it's really hard to blend in. Another one that you could go with is Tactician because of the projectile damage pin. Pin is really strong this league, and because we're doing nothing but projectile damage, this can stack on really well. Additionally, we get 50% less reservation. And the last class that I wanted to kind of highlight, which I had a lot of fun with, was the Druid Oracle. Druid Oracle gives us a lot of utility from the Ascendancy. But where it falls short is it's really far from most of the nodes that we need, primarily being armor break resonance. One of the huge utilities that we get from it is inevitable crits. This, along with sniper's marks, allows us to stack a ton of frenzy charges in boss battles. Even though we lower our crit damage to a point where it's non-existent, we are generating those frenzy charges, which help do a ton of damage. Additionally, we get walk the paths not taken. This allows us to see additional nodes on the tree, which work really well for Nados. There's a lot of skill effect duration, there's a lot of fizz damage, and this helps a lot with scaling the damage, especially early on, but it falls short later on when you're needing to scale it. We also get entwined realities. This allows us to allocate passives in the tree in a medium radius of keystone skills. What this means is that, for example, what I do is I take hollow palm technique, and this allows me to grab kite runner, things like frantic swings, things like distracted targets. This really becomes a good utility to saving a lot of passive points, which you can use in other areas. Another good spot is mind over matter. This allows me to grab all natural and storm charge along with calibration. Really good utility without having to waste a bunch of passives to spec into it. So Druid is good, but at the end of the day, it kind of falls short because of how far we have to spec and the damage that we lose. Now for the final part, the skill tree. Rather than going over every single class, I'm going to go over Amazon because that's the one I generally recommend. For the most part, most of your NATO builds will cross around 70 to 80% of the same nodes. That's because that's generally the way to scale them. There's different ways with crit and just base damage, and I'll kind of talk about it here and then talk about some nodes that you might want to consider. So to start off, you'll generally be going up to the monk side. This is pretty much every time. For this build, I did generally just ES because of the Escientia Sanguis. Now for the final part, we're talking about the skill tree. Rather than going over each individual class, I'm going to be talking about the Amazon just because that's the one that I recommend the most. For the most part, most of your NATO builds are going to have around 70 to 80% of the same nodes because that's generally the best way to scale it, especially when it comes to crit. To start, I'll talk about how you want to get damage, and then we'll go into crit, and then we'll go into defenses. To start, you're going to want to come up here to this side. This is a good node to get early on when you're scaling damage, and then coming up to here, grabbing these attack nodes and these attack speed. Continuing on, you're going to want to come up here and grab some of these attack damage nodes. This gives you some really solid damage early on and allows you to really scale in the early game. For the most part, you're always going to be wanting scaling into the monk side, whether it's coming from the druid side, whether it's coming from the merc side, whether it's coming from ranger huntress. You're always going to be wanting to scale up here because of the utility that we get from the tree. Additionally, you want to come up here, grab this attack speed and attack damage. These are really strong just to give us that early damage. From there, we can always spec into kite runner with more projectile speed and projectile damage. As we said before, any projectile speed that we get gets converted over to projectile damage, along with still giving us that projectile speed because of projectile acceleration 3. And like we talked about before, if you're running blind, these are good to kind of consider for additional damage reduction and additional crit chance. Moving from there, we can also look to grab some of these physical damage nodes if we're having a hard time getting the frenzy charges from resonance. Some other physical nodes that you can grab are these ones down here. These are really strong as well, and this gives you a ton of extra fizz damage. Some other nodes that you really want to go ahead and grab are these spear damage nodes right here. These are probably the strongest nodes in the game when it comes to spear and scaling spear. So that's why we want to come down here as well. We're already down here because of Dance of Death, how effective it is to generate those 3 stages on Whirling Slash along with the skill speed. So we might as well go ahead and grab all of this damage and crit chance that we get. Moving up, I would highly recommend grabbing these nodes. We get 48% increased damage from our companion because of this node right here, Inspiring Ally. Increases and reductions to companion damage also apply to you. One additional thing you can do as well is if you're looking to get more reservation, you can spend 3 points and you can grab these right here. These will allow you to run things like Blasphemy without having to get that extra spirit. Another way that we scale our Nados is through frenzy charges, so that's why we go ahead and grab these. There's another nodes that you can grab right here, but it only gives us 1 additional maximum frenzy charge, while this one gives us 2. This is kind of up to you. What I would recommend early on is when you don't have enough passive skill points to come over here and grab all of this, I would recommend grabbing these. This will give you that additional one that will just give you a little bit more extra Nados and a little bit extra damage in the early game. When it comes to speccing into crit, your biggest nodes are going to come from grabbing Heart Stopping and Heart Breaking. These come hand in hand with stacking crit chance and crit damage, along with these nodes up here, True Strike for the Jugular and Deadly Force. These are huge additional bonuses from our crit, along with Moment of Truth as well. Another crit node that you can also spec into is Critical Exploit. This is just a base 25% increased crit chance. This is also really strong if you're struggling to really maximize your crit. And if you're really struggling a ton, I would recommend coming up here to Careful Assassin. This gives us a ton of crit chance at the expense of crit damage. Again, this is if you're having a really hard time getting crit or having a hard time getting a really strong T2, T3 crit Healic Spear. Additionally, when you spec up here, you can go ahead and grab Chaos Inoculation. Just make sure that you have enough ES to account for it. When it comes to these nodes up here, I really wouldn't recommend it. For this build, this was my 0.3 build where I really wasn't testing evasion, so I just went full ES along with the Ascendancy node, which allows us to get that additional ES build up with the Sanguise. But for the most part, I would recommend staying away from that. Now, when it comes defensively, what I would recommend is getting all of these evasion ES nodes along with these ones right here. Spectral Ward is really strong along with High Alert. High Alert gives us 50% evasion when on full life, which for the most part we're always going to be on full life. And then some other defensive utilities that you can go ahead and grab is Mystic Stance and Rapid Recharge. This just helps for other classes where you don't have that instant recharge and allows you to really bring that faster recharge rate down to 2.5, 2 seconds, even more if you have a good roll on your armor. Some other nodes that you can kind of look to get to help additionally with your defense are these nodes right here, the Wildcat. This gives us 40% increased evasion while moving, which is pretty much all the time, and it gives us deflection rating to 10% of our evasion rating. Again, really strong, really good defensive layer. This is something that I would highly recommend. Other than that, that pretty much covers everything when it comes to the tree. The only thing I would recommend is if you're not speccing crit, look to get all of these physical nodes, attack damage nodes like we talked about. This will help really bring that extra damage up to make up for the fact that we're not critting. I'll leave a link down to the filter that I use so that you can get the best bases, and the bases that you need always show up. That pretty much wraps it up for the tree. If you have any questions or are wondering what my other trees look like, they'll be in the Mobalytics guide, and feel free to stop by my Twitch and ask any questions that you have. If you made it to this point of the video, I appreciate you guys for hanging around so long. If you happen to get any information or this video helps you out or you're enjoying the build, please leave a like, comment, make sure to subscribe. This helps me grow and continue to make more videos in the future. And if you're sticking around this long, I wanted to show you guys one of the coolest builds that I've made thus far, and these are the Chaos Infused Nados. So for this, essentially all you really need is the Spire of Ire Healic Spear. Pretty hard to get unique. It's a T1 unique, so it's not something that's very commonly dropped, but if you do, this might be something fun to do. Essentially what this does is it converts your frenzy charges into chaos surges, which end up leaving the Nados looking like chaos Nados like you see on the screen here. Ideally with this, you also want to run Original Sin, which is why I said it's not really realistic, but it's something that you can try to get if you happen to be farming a lot. This is really cool, really novelty build. Additionally, you can also do any of the Shrine Scepters. Aside from the Palma Dreamer, I've tried this. It doesn't work the best with generating frenzy charges, but it's really good overall to give you that extra damage. But again, you won't be able to make the Chaos Nados, so I suggest you stick with either of the Shrine Scepters. Other than that, that's pretty much the entire build. When it comes to the class that you want to play, it kind of really depends on any of the ones that we talked about. Ideally, I would recommend the Chalupa just because it kind of builds into the theme of chaos and the chaos damage. Other than that, really run what you want to run. You can convert pretty much all of the elemental damage into chaos damage and get a ton of extra damage. I pushed this build to T2 bosses. You guys can see if you could push it to T3 and even Arbiter. Other than that, again, thank you for supporting me. Thank you for watching the video this far. I hope you guys enjoy. I'll see you on the next one.